Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Chamber's 2022 Economic Outlook event. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and I didn't realize this when we picked the venue for this, which has such a beautiful view, but included in the view as we discuss the economy is the Boston Tea Party ship and museum. So I think there's some sort of symbolism and balance between the conversation and the fact that we're sitting in the location of where that event took place 249 years ago. Next year will be the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, so I hope you'll focus on that. At the Chamber, we try to feature the most prominent leaders in Greater Boston and beyond, and today is certainly no exception. Our annual Economic Outlook event features local business leaders and a special invited guest today who can speak candidly and firsthand from the perspective of today's economy. And maybe as you listen, it might influence how much more or less you spend on Christmas this year. Who knows? Who knows how you'll feel walking out of the room. Like most states in this country, Massachusetts is experiencing changes to its economic landscape really on a historical level. Rising levels of inflation, supply chain issues, high energy costs, all have an impact on our communities and our businesses. And you know that all of those issues disproportionately affect those with low income and certainly our small business community. So there's a lot to think about in our economy today. With this in mind, the Chamber and I still are optimistic about Boston and the Commonwealth having a unique capacity to continue building a vibrant economy and maintain a level of competitiveness that attracts both businesses and talent into our region and enables a robust level of entrepreneurship and startup activity. So despite the headwinds that we may feel and see, we certainly are still bullish on Boston and Massachusetts. So with that, you didn't come to hear me speak. I'll go through a few logistical notes, make some introductions, and then we'll get about the business of this morning's event. First, today's event is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page, so please, we'll certainly advertise that, but please share that information with colleagues. And a very big thank you to today's sponsor and a continuing partner with the Greater Boston Chamber, M&T Bank. Today and going forward, if you're not familiar with M&T Bank, I hope you'll take the time to learn about this leading business in our region. We're very proud to partner with M&T Bank on this timely event. Beyond the business and economic expertise that M&T Bank brings to the table, today's programming is free for all attendees because of their support. So a big thank you to M&T Bank. So let's get started and let's take a look at our economy through some different lenses, which I think you'll enjoy. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. LeBrent Crite, President of Bentley University. Dr. Crite, or Brent as he likes to be called, is a highly experienced education leader with a distinguished background in global economic and business development. And as we think about it, higher education is an important industry and economic driver in Massachusetts, and Bentley is all about educating the business leaders of the future for our region and beyond. So it's great to have the president of that distinguished institution with us today. Next, I'd like to welcome Steve Werner, President of National Grid New England. Since joining National Grid in late 2021, Steve has been responsible for gas and electric operations in Massachusetts while being a vocal supporter of reliable and affordable clean energy solutions for more than 2 million New England customers. Steve and the leadership in any utility have a particularly difficult task in today's society, creating a balance between our climate change goals, energy costs, and the reliability that I'm sure we all depend on in our personal lives and in our business lives. Next, I'd like to introduce our moderator, a star continuing to arise in our region, Grace Lee, Eastern Massachusetts Regional Bank President and Group Lead of New England Government Banking for M&T Bank, and a Chamber board member, to introduce our featured economist, Joelle Gamble, and then Grace will lead the conversation with our panelists. So Grace and panelists, please join me up on stage, and we'll get the program started.
So thank you, Jim, and I appreciate the opportunity to represent M&T Bank. This is our first opportunity to partner with the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, but more significantly, it is a continued commitment to the Boston Chamber and the region on behalf of M&T Bank that was started under People's United Bank. So while the brand is new today, the people and the bankers are all the same, and this is our 4th year doing this, and I'm incredibly excited because I feel like I made it to the big kids table. But I shouldn't get that excited because my former boss and my current boss, Pat Sullivan, is at the same table, so I think I'm kind of have to work my way up. So thank you, Pat, for everything you've done for the Chamber and us. You know, combined, M&T Bank is a super regional. If you look at the combined years that M&T Bank and People's have been together, this year we merged, we have over 300 years of banking experience. M&T, 165 years, and I believe at the time of acquisition, People's United Bank was 168 years. I point that out because both banks are very committed and have a long history of working with their communities. And so that is something that we are incredibly excited about continuing as we, you know, not only continue what we started, but as a super regional, kind of scale that out and amplify all the great things that we're doing. So for that opportunity, I want to thank you. But you don't want to hear about M&T. Who you're really here to hear about is Joelle and the panelists, and I have the honor of introducing Joelle. She is our featured speaker today. She's the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor. She's frequently seen on TV too, so you may ask for her autograph after the session because she is a frequent flyer of the media circuit. So prior to becoming the chief economist, Joelle worked on the transition team for the Biden-Harris administration, serving on the economic policy segment of that transition. Prior to that, subsequent to that, she accepted a permanent position with the White House National Economic Council as a special assistant to the president on economic policy, where she focused on consumer finance, including student debt, not a hot topic today, right? Medical debt, retirement policies, and labor issues. Prior to that, she worked as a principal at the Omidyar Network's economic program and served as the director and advisor to the CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. It's an economic think tank, and I could go on, but truly, you don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from Joelle. So with no further ado, Joelle, if you'd like to join me on the stage.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Jim, for having me here today. Thank you to M&T Bank for this lovely, lovely breakfast and for making it free and accessible. It's just an honor to be here and speak with you today. So I'm going to go over, just a little bit of a big picture of the economy, at least from where I sit within the U.S. Department of Labor and the Biden-Harris administration. I'm going to do it quickly, but I look forward to the panel and having a conversation with my fellow distinguished guests and also hearing from you about what's on your mind about today's economy. I know there's a lot of uncertainty right out in the U.S. So I will just hopefully successfully navigate the slideshow. Let's see here. Am I pressing the correct button? It's the green one? Maybe I'm not. Well, I think as we get that set up, I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is that I'm about to say. First off, okay, here we go. So this is me. chief economist, not a slideshow expert, clearly. But I'm here to talk a little bit about, something I know fairly well, which is the US labor market. Every day that is part of my job. I get the pleasure of working with Secretary Walsh, who, as I'm sure many of you know well here, who is a wonderful boss as he leads our labor department. But I will also go over a little bit on prices and a little bit on the macro outlook. But I will be brief and hopefully efficient, as that's what many of us are known for in the econ world. There we go. So the administration's kind of view of the economic outcome is, I would say, an optimistic one, in that we are hoping, as the president has said, that we can transition to a period of steady and stable growth, essentially a period of below-trend GDP growth that will help us bring prices down while still setting us on a track towards continued payroll growth in the long run and economic growth in the long run. For the labor market, part of what gives us some optimism there is that we have seen a very fast recovery. So it's the fastest jobs recovery in the last 4 decades. Here, this is a chart from the start of the new business cycle, right? So the start from which a recession was declared, and then the period it took for all of the jobs that were in the economy before to, match the number of jobs we had in that point in time. So we reached that much faster in this recovery than we have in prior recoveries. You can see the recovery from the Great Recession was a jobless recovery for some time, though eventually we did, of course, get all those jobs back. We've seen really fast average monthly wage growth. This is just since January 2021. 480,000 jobs is the monthly average, though of course there's been some deceleration, right? Since even just this year. Last month, we learned that we added 263,000 jobs, which of course the market read as still too hot, but is indeed a deceleration from where we were earlier in the business cycle. We now have 1.5 million more jobs on non-farm payrolls than we did in February 2020. The prime age employment to population ratio, that's just us looking at jobs for workers who are most likely going to be in the workforce, so less likely to be retired, less likely to be in school, relative to their population size. That's nearly recovered, though it's been a little bit flat in recent months. And then this is a recovery because of the speed, right? Because of the difficulty that a lot of employers had hiring. We did see low-wage workers and workers without a college degree see faster wage growth than we typically see in a recovery. And so that's important. You see that in a lot of the industries that are low wage, and the fact that they're trying to get people back to in-person work. And so that's a bit of a tailwind, right, for the tough waters we have to navigate ahead. I do think this button is not my friend. Here we go. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the headwinds, right, that I think that we see in today's labor market. So we're trying to navigate a deceleration in job growth and what I believe to be a deceleration in hiring intensity, though the JOLTS data that we published, the job openings data, has been coming down quite slowly, though it's coming down. I do think that that's going to be a headwind. It's a tough thing to navigate, and often payrolls are actually what we call a coincident indicator, meaning if a recession has started, you could still see some payroll growth, even if we're in a downturn. That does not mean that we are in a downturn right now, but that does make this a really difficult challenge. And as you know, most of the things I'm talking about, the Fed is also looking at that, though I cannot comment on Fed policy. So just consider all of this in the context of those big decisions they have to make. This changed too quickly. I do think it's important that we're also navigating, right, a deceleration, hopefully, in employer costs. We need to see employer costs come down, while at the same time, we want to see compensation growth, right, that actually supports, a rising real disposable income. That's important for consumer spending. That's important for growth, right? And so there's this tough balance, right, between bringing down costs, but making sure we have wage growth that's sustainable. A nice rule of thumb I like to go by is productivity plus inflation. Often that's about 3% year-over-year wage growth. We also, frankly, need to boost the labor force participation rate. So, right now, the labor force participation rate is low relative to where it was pre-pandemic, though it's actually online with projections of the labor force participation rate from before the pandemic. And so we were at a period where we had a higher labor force participation rate. It has come down. It's down to where it might have been if projections were accurate. And so the question now becomes one, I think, for policy, right? Where is the role of immigration reform in this? Where is the role of workforce development in bringing in some of the workers who have been on the sidelines for too long? Often those who we call marginally attached, meaning they've looked for work in the last year, they want a job, but they can't quite get one. And also where's the role for care and the cost of care and other costs that are frankly cost prohibitive, making it too costly for people to go to work because they might not make enough to actually cover the costs of going to work, like making sure they had childcare for their children. So I think that that's a very important role for policymakers right now, is how do we actually boost the labor force participation rate in the medium and the long term. And finally, I think there's a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns about the labor market and the ways in which the pandemic may have accelerated existing trends, and they could affect things that we care about, like productivity. I also want to note that there's some things that might be affecting the sectoral allocation of the economy. So right here in this slide, you can see that these are essentially super sectors, right? So these are clumps of industries, and their employment levels relative to February 2020, which I like to call the pre-pandemic baseline. So you can see there's a number of sectors that have completely recovered, and they are much more elevated in their employment levels. There are others that are lower. I want to draw attention to leisure and hospitality. It's a very large sector. And while we are still well below the pre-pandemic level, there might be something else going on where we actually track the number of businesses openings and closings in our surveys. It's lagged. But you can see that actually there have been about 11,000 leisure and hospitality establishments that have closed since the start of the pandemic, relative to the number they had before. So they're just down 11,000 establishments. A lot of those are in food and drinking places, so restaurants, right? And so we're looking at a scenario where there may be fewer jobs, there may also be fewer establishments to hire those workers. So there's something deeper going on there. Okay, now tailwinds. I often get headwinds and tailwinds confused, but tailwinds are good things. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about where I do see some room for optimism, that we can get to that period of steady and stable growth, though it's below trend growth. And that's because we are, like I said, coming in with a really fast jobs recovery than the last 3 cycles. Unemployment rates near historic lows, meaning people who are looking for work can generally find work. That means that there's also, because of the speed of the recovery, there's been limited scarring for workers. So scarring essentially means that you have not experienced, if you've experienced a long period of unemployment, it's actually harder for you to then get a job, right? You have that blank on your resume. And when we have slow recoveries, there's a lot more people who get scarred, right? They have a long period of unemployment. It makes it harder to employ them in the future. Because the recovery was quicker, there are fewer people with gaps on their resume, makes it easier for them to get jobs in the future, makes it easier for them to move up the career ladder. And so that's honestly a good thing for the labor market and for the American workforce. We are seeing some of that supply-demand imbalance improving in the labor market that you often hear the Federal Reserve leadership talking about. I have job openings up in the top corner that has been coming down, though it's elevated. And then I have the relationship between quits and the unemployment rate here. Often we compare job openings to quits, but the rate at which people are quitting firms is actually a really important measure of how tight the labor market is too. Many of you have probably experienced that. If you have a high attrition of workers, it's not just the cost of hiring new workers, you're also losing the workers you have who you've already invested in training, who already have experience on the job. And that also can really be harmful. And so seeing the quits rate come down is actually, I think, another good way to think about how tight the labor market is today. And it's been coming down without the unemployment rate going up too much. So I will briefly talk a bit about prices. This is something that the department also produces. We're most known for a lot of the labor market data like the unemployment rate and labor force participation, but we also produce the Consumer Price Index, which is one of 2 measures of inflation. The Fed most closely looks at a different measure produced by the Commerce Department, which is PCE, which I also touch on right here as well. So there's a few things that are, I think, tailwinds when it comes to prices, one of which is the fact that PCE, for instance, has been cooling somewhat this year. So it's down from 5.6% in the first quarter of this year to 4.6% in the third quarter. That's an annual rate. Monthly core PCE last month was 0.2%. Core CPI, the measure we produce, was 0.3% in October. There was the first time actually since March that good prices declined in the CPI, which was last month. And the latest PPI data suggests that some easing of upstream pressures is happening, with an emphasis on some. I would also note that wholesale and vehicle prices are down 15% year to date, and domestic auto production is up nearly 18% year to date. That's all just pointing towards some easing of those pressures that a lot of businesses have been feeling. At the same time, though, I would note, of course, geopolitical dynamics are important here as well, including the war in Ukraine, supply chain challenges resulting from them, and other disruptions in other countries. At the same time, I like to emphasize this. It's really important that we get real wages up because we really want to see consumers' purchasing power grow, right? We just want to do it in a way that's sustainable. I also wanted to show you all, just really quickly, last month's CPI figure over the month. It grew 0.4%. I quickly wanted to just decompose it so that you can see, what kind of classes of goods were actually contributing the most to inflation over the month. So food and energy prices are important. They're actually becoming a little bit less important in our month-to-month data. Energy prices continue to be important, of course, too. Again, this is month-to-month. Both of those categories of goods are still high over the year. So if consumers are like, oh, you're telling me gas prices are going down, I don't see that. They're still high relative to where they were last year. There's just been some deceleration in price growth. But I want to really point out here rent and OER, which is the most, I think, important component of housing. That was almost half of the monthly change in inflation last month. And that's important in part because it's a really hard measure to get down, and the data we have is lagged. So if you're seeing some of these private sector businesses, or private sector data that's showing new rental prices going down, new housing prices going down, that's an optimistic thing that's happening. At the same time, it's going to take a while for it to show up in the Department of Labor's data because of how we measure it. We look at all rental contracts, right? We look at all housing prices, not just new purchases, essentially. But there's other signs that are positive, like you can see here used car and trucks. You can see here airline fares. They were not always negative contributions to monthly inflation. They used to be positive. And so there is some signs of slowing. At the same time, it is a slow moderation that's happening in prices today. And then I will finally be quick. This is less my element. I do labor economics, but I wanted to try and touch on the macro picture just a little bit because I feel like it's very important to the folks in this room. So in addition to what I said on prices and in the labor market, which of course all adds up to the macro picture, there are two other things that I wanted to point out that I am personally watching, and I know a number of other economists in the government are watching, which is essentially what's happening to GDP, right? And so to the left, you have three different measures. We actually have four different measures of GDP. I don't need to go into all of them. What matters is the purple line. So the purple bar graph here is what we call private domestic final purchases. It strips out the parts of GDP that can be somewhat more volatile, whether it's the trade balance, whether it's inventory investments, government spending, all of that stuff. And so it really gives us a good sense of where growth might be going. And as you can see, growth is slowing, but it's not negative according to that particular measure. And so I think that that's an important kind of measure to follow. It's publicly available on the BEA website, but that's kind of how I think about growth moving forward, is to strip out those things that can be really volatile and look at the core part of output. And the other piece I wanted to highlight for you all is labor productivity. I've mentioned it a little bit throughout my presentation, but I do think it's important because in the short run, productivity can be really, really volatile, right? And there's a lot that we don't know, but in the long run, that's what we need to look at in terms of how much workers in the US are producing per hour of work. And so there's a few things going on. First of all, this data was updated this morning, and I finished my slide on Monday. So that really, really tiny sliver bar graph on the far end, that went up a little bit. It was 0.3% for the quarter. It's actually 0.8% for the quarter, in part because GDP was also revised up. But at the same time, there's a lot of volatility in labor productivity, and that's normal. It's normal in part because shifts in productivity are not just statistical phenomenons. They're real things that happen in the workplace, and it takes a really long time for the data to actually start reflecting that. And so there's things that could be happening right now in the labor market, what I call a composition effect. So new hires may not be as productive as people who've been on the job before, so we're hiring a lot of new people right now. Industries that have lower productivity workforces, not because they're not valuable, but just the nature of the work, are the ones that are hiring the most right now. So leisure and hospitality, retail, et cetera. And so that changes the composition of productivity. And over the longer term, we'll actually get a better sense of what might have changed, whether learning loss is affecting productivity, for example, whether work from home is affecting productivity. And so that's another kind of macro picture that I just wanted to point out to you all. It's volatile right now, but I do think you should watch this space. And so I think that's the end of my hopefully wonky, but not too wonky presentation. But I just wanted to finish with saying that we're really cognizant of the fact that prices are high in the administration, that the global economic outlook can be shaky. But at the same time, the economic data that we look at shows that there's reason to be somewhat optimistic toward the president's goal of bringing down inflation, essentially without giving up the gains from this historic recovery. And that's our goal as policymakers, as economists in the administration. And so I'm just grateful to be here. I'm grateful to learn from the knowledge in this room, and happy to join the panel and answer any questions. Thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. One of the things that I was noticing is, we have a lot of things impacting, and I appreciate you saying that there's a lot of volatility that, because that was one of the things that I observed, but that's normal. So I think, something that everyone is looking for is the new normal. And so to have somebody say, okay, this looks a little crazy, but this is normal, it puts it in context. So I appreciate that kind of context and insight, and I'm going to now have all of that information applied to all of these industry experts right here. No pressure, Jen. So, this first question is going to be directed to all the panelists. You talked about the recession, the expectation of a recession, maybe not. We have a lot of people opining that, oh, we may be in a recession, we're going into a recession, we're not going into a recession. With that being said, I think everybody's in agreement that there's a lot of headwinds coming our way in 2023. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is for your respective industries, how are you preparing for that? And what are you seeing in your, segment, Brent, in higher education?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Delighted to join such an august group of folks on stage. And look, it's clear to me, first, that the sort of conditions for yield curve convergence exist, and while I'll leave it to our economist colleagues to sort of determine the impact of that, my response as to whether or not there's going to be a recession is sort of contrary to what I've been reading anyway. I believe that it is not only inevitable, but I recall the chair of the Boston Fed, Dr. Susan Collins, refer to, I think I'm quoting here, a softish landing. I personally don't see anything soft about the landing. I think for families and households that are going to be impacted, that is going to be dramatic and potentially profound. And for me, the reasons are, first of all, Joel mentioned geopolitical uncertainties, which for me is defined primarily by this chasm between autocracy and democracy, primarily autocracy in China, Iran, and Russia, and the byproducts and spillovers of that. I think the commodity shocks that we're seeing, trade partner and supply chain disruptions, the weaponization of food and energy, the insidious and unsustainable reliance of Western European countries on Russian energy, which, by the way, if you go back 40 years ago to the Helmut Kohl administration in West Germany then, he was warned, and I think in hindsight they're regretting that. But this has had a drag on productivity in Western Europe's most productive economy, Germany. The impact of that seems clear to me. Closer to home, inflation continues to be a challenge, as we heard, prices. We've seen the first inclinations of job loss and job reduction in the high-tech sector. 70% or so of executives suggest that they will probably be making similar moves. The fact that the very policies that the Fed could pursue to negate the opportunities for recession would in fact exacerbate inflation. And so they have some really tight parameters and not many degrees of freedom. Housing prices, manufacturing, all to me suggest a direction that is going to inevitably result in a recession. And as is always the case, it's the most marginal communities and households that will be affected. And again, for them, there will be nothing soft about this landing.
Thank you, Brent. Speaking of, gas prices, and I feel like that's a nice transition to utilities, Steve.
Sure.
You know, what are you saying, and what are you identifying as potential trackers?
Sure. I guess with regard to your broader question, I'll yield to my academic colleagues here and my professional economists for predictions, because my predictions are always wrong, right? But I would tell you
Me too.
yeah, I would do much better in the stock market if I was good at predictions. I will tell you, though, at a high level, we do see continued economic development activity in this region. So while maybe not at the pace that it was, you know, there's still growth and activity here. So there is going to be impacts that are different by region in any type of potential recession, right? I came to this role from a job I had in the Mid-Atlantic, and that area was typically buffered because of its proximity to federal government, and they never saw the lows. This area has a lot of industries that tend to be a little less vulnerable to recessions as well. That said, I also share concerns about that doesn't help everyone, right, in the region. But more directly to impacts on energy, I'll get to the commodity stuff in a minute, but when I talked about my delivery service, but you know, I run a gas and electric delivery business in this region, and we're tracking not just delays in supply chain, but cost escalation in supply chain for just about everything that we buy. But for the slowdown somewhat, we'd have a hard time actually even keeping up with the demands for new connections and the work that we do, just because it's that significant, despite the fact that we maintain reserves for emergencies, those type of things. Every single aspect of supply chain across my industry has been impacted and not fully recovered. So there's, if we had more domestic manufacturing, I think that would help significantly. And I was happy to see the CHIPS Act pass and bring in the future an impact. Still probably not enough. We need more stimulus for domestic manufacturing to not have this country be as vulnerable to the types of disruptions that we've seen over the last couple of years. On the commodity side, you saw the headlines of higher energy prices, both for electric and gas, regardless of the delivery company that you use. Let me just spend a minute talking about what's behind that and why is this region so exposed to international market prices. We're in this region actually more electrically, and we're more of an island than it appears. The two most expensive parts of the country for energy are Hawaii and then this region. And the reason for that is that systematically over a number of decades, there's been a lack of expansion of pipeline or transmission resource into the area. So this region is dependent upon imported gas to make the electrical generation work in the winter. And right now is the most expensive time in the world to buy liquefied natural gas that can be shipped in on a ship. So while the U.S. is now the net exporter in the world, right, and really saving Europe from the dependence on Russian gas by increasing LNG exports, today you can't take a ship from one U.S. port and bring it into another U.S. port because of a rule called the Jones Act. And you saw some headlines on that. So, I have to buy gas from Trinidad and Tobago and everywhere else to bring it into the Boston Harbor should we need that. Since you got a little geeky, I can get a little geeky, right? So I'll go. Electric generation in this region burns gas to make electricity through the peak periods. In the winter, because the gas pipeline and that constraint that exists, in the winter, the gas pipelines that come into this region, the capacity on them is all needed for natural gas heating. So when generators are looking for gas capacity, they have to go and import it, or they have to burn oil in this region to get through that. Now, what's the future? yes, this region wants to move to renewable sources, but we've got a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built, both to actually build those offshore wind structures and then also build the transmission lines to bring it into this region. So in the immediate future, my message is to you, energy prices are not going to abate substantially. We're not going to necessarily see the peak that we see with a war going on, but to think that this region's going to have energy prices on par with other regions of the country, that's not realistic thinking, given the constraints that exist for bringing power into this region. Right now, there's not cost-effective storage, so you're exposed to the peak and the peak pricings that are in this region. We do see tremendous opportunity, though, in the future, right? When we are able to reduce our dependence on imported LNG in this region through the offshore wind development and other renewable energy sources that can then begin to supplement the power needs of this region. And we are absolutely doing everything we can to make sure we're not the constraint in that process. But where you can help me is being a balanced observer to the debate when infrastructure needs to be cited, right? Because that is the most significant challenge we have to bringing down energy prices in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So we have not the two most optimistic outlooks right over here. Joelle, bring it home.
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not optimistic. I mean, I guess I am somewhat optimistic. But, I mean, I'm not one to opine on the probability of a recession, though I do track recession probabilities and I'm aware that they're elevated, in part because, frankly, as you said, I'm really focused on people, right? What's actually happening in the labor market. And a lot of harm can come to people when there is a downturn because they lose their jobs. I mentioned earlier that can affect their future employment opportunities, et cetera. And so when I think about this question of what's going to happen to the economy, big picture in the next few months, I think of this kind of dynamic we have where there's a fight essentially between continued strong growth and bringing down prices. And we often hear that in the conversation around Fed policy, which I cannot comment on, so this is just from my perspective, in which we have this challenge in which we want to see consumer spending go up, but not too much, right? Because we still want to see continued growth. We still want to see a lot of business transactions going on. That's important for our economy to overall grow, but if there's too much consumer spending, then folks worry about prices going up, right? And so there's this balancing act that has to happen. The same thing happens with wages in the economy, right? Where we want to see compensation grow so that people have continued growing purchasing power. And frankly, that's also important from an equity perspective because not everybody actually faces the same inflation rate. A lot of folks who are frankly lower income, right, they can't buy a cheaper good when the price of a good goes up. They're often already buying the cheapest possible product in whatever category they're spending in. And so actually not everyone is even facing the same rate of inflation, and that's why purchasing power becomes even more important. But you'll also hear people talking about compensation growth coming up too much and possibly affecting prices through a pass-through to consumer prices from the wage bill to the price that consumers pay. And so there's this tension there as well. And so the way I think about it is, over the next few months, the big question is, can we get that balancing act right? Can we get to a place where we can still see real disposable income going up like it did last quarter, which is a good thing, so that people can continue to buy the things they need. We can still continue to see purchasing in the economy boost payrolls. People can still have jobs, but at a rate that's ultimately sustainable over the long run. We've had a really fast recovery, right? And the question is now, how do we have a sustainable one? And so it's hard, but I think from where I sit, given the focus on the labor market and the importance of a job for people's financial security, I almost have to be optimistic.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot because I'm going to ask Steve, because you touched on it. I think everybody has recognized utility costs are going to be very high. Going into winter, thus far it's been mild, but costs are going to soar for families and companies. Putting a positive spin on it, what advice can you give our business segment and families on, how to prepare and be more efficient, or any wisdom that you can just give for us to kind of take home with us to our respective businesses and homes?
Okay. The price spike is affecting the commodity. That's the gas that you use or the electricity that you use. It's not the delivery service. What your utility does is brings that supply to you. And if you're not able to make a choice of where you buy your energy from, or you don't make a choice of where you buy your energy from, your utility buys that energy for you. And so the headlines that have been released are about, for those customers who have not shopped, to choose another supplier. Many businesses do compete, procure their energy. We still deliver it, so many of you may not see the price spike in your business. If you don't know, I would suggest you ask your teams to find out. Are we already contracted? Are we going to, so you can properly forecast for your energy costs for this winter. There still are competitive offers out there for a business to procure energy. On the residential side, many customers are covered under a municipal aggregation where your town or municipality or city buys the energy for you. If you don't know, if you look at your bill, you'll see down where it details the commodity part, a mention of maybe you're under Boston City Municipal Aggregation or something like that. Or it may say you're on the standard service from the utility. If you're on the standard service from the utility, you will be exposed to the price spike. Now, what's causing it? We go to the market just a couple times a year, and we went to the market for the winter prices at the worst time. And now it's a state-regulated process when you go, but if you go right after a war breaks out and energy prices are spiked, you're going to get high prices, and that's what we saw. Those prices are just for the winter period, and they went into effect November 1st, but you don't really see the impact until your December bill for your November consumption, and then really until the winter prices start to hit, the winter temperatures start to hit. Do you see the increase in demand that results in that combination of usage? So it's that price times quantity, right? It's that quantity that goes up when there's colder temperatures. So after the holidays, when people are already dealing with their expenses from the holidays, they'll have that bill for their December energy use, and that's when I think we'll hear the most concerns. Now, what can people do about it? Well, don't wait for that to happen, right? If you haven't taken action to understand where you're procuring energy from, please do that. On top of that, I would say the best thing we can do as users of energy is to use less. Only use what energy is necessary. So if you haven't audited your business or had your residents audited from an energy use perspective, please take advantage of the various programs that are available. And if you can always send me a note if you're not familiar with where to go. Because I'm not saying to sacrifice in any way. I'm saying just be efficient, and there's a lot of options, and there's a lot of help out there for people to make energy efficiency investments in their home or business. For folks that you may know that are struggling to meet their bills, we've been out in communities and online and everywhere we can to try to help people understand their options available to them to get into payment plans. Where we can balance out the bill throughout the year so so if you took that winter price spike and smoothed it out, that can help. There's also a lot of customers in this region that are eligible for either a senior discount or other low income discount, yet they have not signed up for it. And we can help them with those. And we've also, on the charitable side, corporately made some substantial charitable donations to ensure that the energy assistance organizations in this region had funds. The federal government has really come through. We're hoping the state government will also come through with energy assistance. But we also made some charitable contributions to make sure those were available to the business market, the small business, as well as the moderate income market, which typically doesn't qualify for energy assistance. So we went to some United Ways and others of the world with some dollars to allow them to help those that maybe didn't qualify for the various federal income limits. Because a lot more people are going to, when your rates go up as much as they did, a lot more people will struggle this winter than in the past. But thank you for your question, Grace.
Well, thank you. And I hope that information is going to be available through the chamber, because my takeaway is use less. You remind me of my dad, use less, and make sure that people that qualify for discounts, your neighbors, family members, friends, apply for the discounts, get educated on our choices, because I have to say I haven't done that, so I'll be the first one to do that. So thank you very much, Steve. Brent, I'm going to pivot, in Massachusetts, in the greater Boston area, one of the largest economic drivers is higher education and healthcare. So as you look at, higher education and the impact of the economy there, what are you seeing and, how are you navigating that landscape in the context of not just students, but, operating, one of the prestigious business schools in Boston, but, amongst your peers as well?
Yeah, thanks for that, Grace. But I want to just briefly clarify my previous comment. If I came off as less than optimistic about the U.S. economy, that is not at all the case. I am, in fact, quite bullish on the dynamism and the strength and the creativity of the U.S. economy. I've committed my life to working in some of the most marginalized, poorest places on the planet, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe and everything in between, to harness the private sector and to unleash the power of capitalism. I just happen to believe that at current, there is a convergence of factors and conditions that are going to result in short-term difficulty. But we will get out of that very, very soon. So very bullish, very optimistic long-term. But it's going to be a challenge, I think, over the next 12 to 16 months. So, I've had the pleasure, after I started out in the private sector many years ago, and just the pleasure and privilege. It is an awesome thing to lead a university and to sort of be the keeper of the hopes and aspirations of students, and for me, it's the most important work in the world. And yet, higher education institutions, generally speaking, are defined by, in my view, these 19th century business models trying to operate in a 21st century market, and the orthodoxies and the traditions of higher education have in many ways mitigated our ability to fulfill some of our best intentions and aspirations. With that said, we're not monolithic. A place like Bentley, a small private university in the shadow of giants, these world-class institutions in the most competitive and awesome higher education ecosystem in the world, our approach is going to be different from what you see in Cambridge and other places, and that's okay. I mean, we have to continue to pass the market test, right? We have no choice but to deliver programs and to support students that engenders their confidence to pay the tuition that we ask. And so all of us, however, are concerned, as we ought to be, about the increasing price point divergence, and more critically, because it's really less about the prices than it is the cost that families pay. There's nothing inherently wrong. Well, we can argue that there is a moral case against the prices that we see. But most of those institutions that charge high prices have endowments and have financial support to mitigate the cost per family. For those that don't, that's where we see the difficulty. And we're trying to have a conversation, not easy to have, about the allocation. So in the private sector, this would be like capital allocation decisions, right? How do we allocate scarce and valuable capital? Well, we have capital that we allocate in higher education, but it's defined by metrics and orthodoxies that are unique to higher education. And it's it is absolutely less efficient than it ought to be. I'd like to see if we could address that. I think that we have to pay, look, I'm a business school guy who believes strongly, critically, in the importance of the liberal arts. That's one of the things that's differentiated higher education in the U.S., is this commitment to ensuring the capacity of our students to discern and to reflect critically. And in places like Bentley, where we teach the sort of technical and other fluencies that are aligned with the 21st century innovation economy, we think that's a wonderful combination. But we had no choice but to think critically about the returns on an investment, about the value proposition. Students have lots of opportunity in the market, and we need to do a better job of ensuring the value. The other thing that I want to say that's on our mind, all of us, is that too few universities, including Bentley, reflect the pluralism and the diversity of the communities in which they exist. And this is in fact a moral failing. But more critically, there is a strategic imperative. And we have an obligation in a country whose cornerstones represent fairness and opportunity to extend the platform of these institutions that in many cases can almost ensure intergenerational wealth creation, sustained social and economic mobility. We have an obligation to ensure, in ways that we have often not, that the most marginalized members of the community have access to them. Final thought on this. You know, talent and ability and potential is random and ubiquitous and widely distributed. And we have an obligation to focus less on what students, particularly poor students, have achieved than what their potential is. And that runs somewhat contrary to rankings and test scores and all that. But if we're to be at our best, this is the lens that many of our institutions have to adopt. And I'm really, really proud of the work that we've done just over the last year and a half on so those are some of the challenges that we're trying to deal with.
Thank you, Brent. And I have to say that while I was kind of teasing, saying you weren't being optimistic, what I heard from your message was when times get hard, there's a disproportionate impact that, you know, exclusively hits those that are underrepresented and often, you know, segmented out from our community. So I thank you for bringing that up, reminding us, especially in the business community. And I think not just in the academic venue, I think in every venue there is a lot that we can do, and we all should be being striving to be the best versions of ourselves. And when you try to be the best version of yourself, it's easier to do it when times are good, right? So this, I'm gonna throw this to you, Joelle. Right now, there's so much. It's all things all at once, right? We've got the protracted nature of the pandemic. We have the war in Ukraine. Now we have scarce resources when it comes to gas and oil because of the global economic geopolitical impacts. I guess one question that I would like to know, and I'm sure everybody else, is this has been going on for a while, and how do you think, not that you're a psychic, I said you're an economist, not a psychic, but I'm going to throw this question at you anyways. How much longer do you think that the U.S. can sustain what we're doing, continue trying to be the best version of ourselves, and, not that you can tell, but like how much longer do you think that this is going to go on until we're going to hit a breaking point?
Kind of in the global disruptions that are affecting the U.S. economy, essentially?
And the pandemic and, all the confluence of things.
So I think I would think about your question a few ways. It is, in many ways, the million-dollar question, and I really wish I had a precise answer to it, because it's been such a rough period for so many of us, and it's been hard to do things as normal. We don't even know what the new normal is. I think a few things. One, I'll take it maybe piece by piece. I see a few challenges here. Of course, there's the fact that the pandemic highlighted what I think many of us in this room already knew, just how interconnected the global economy is, and how something that happens, 3,000, 5,000 miles away from here can actually have ramifications, for the American consumer, for US-based businesses. And so the global disruption piece, I would say, is one of it. I'll talk a bit about public health, at least from where I see this in the labor market side, and then I want to talk about the workforce in particular, because I do think that that's a underreported kind of, I think, slow burn threat to the stability of the US economy. So on the first piece, there has been an intense, I think, at least from where I sit in the White House and DOL, in focusing on supply chains from a policy perspective, which I think is important. There's a lot of concern about what's going on in China. The Department of Commerce is actively monitoring it, right? There's a real kind of apparatus being built that I think will be, sustainable in the long term to track and try to figure out ways in which the policy community can actually help address some of these challenges because they have such huge ramifications. So that gives me some optimism. When might it end? I'm not sure. But we have seen some more movement through coordination with the US and our partners in Europe to try and, put pressure on bad actors to cease that disruption, particularly when it comes to the war in Ukraine. The price cap is what I'm referencing. And so I think that there's a lot of work to do there. It's unclear exactly when they'll abate, but I do think that the fact that we're building an apparatus to actually regularly respond to this from not just an international relations, but an economic standpoint is important. On the public health side, obviously we still have a lot of work to do on COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. That's why the president proposed more funding for COVID-19 services and protections in the omnibus, which is still a little uncertain right now. But I wanted to point to the fact that it's also affecting the workforce in a way that's important. We've had elevated health absences from work since the start of the pandemic, which is actually bringing down the labor force participation rate. So there's a clear public health imperative, but also things that we can do to make it safer for people at work so that they do not have to leave work because they are ill, including things like paid sick leave, which of course has been a really, really big topic of debate in recent weeks, particularly at the Department of Labor. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the importance of investing in our workforce, because we need to be able to bring up the labor force participation rate to actually transition to a period of strong growth in the future. We have underinvested in our workforce. We have to invest in, of course, education, and then also pathways to jobs that are not necessarily, formal institutions of higher education. Our secretary is really invested in apprenticeship models and building those up as well. Giving people a chance to learn on the job is also really important because we need to be competitive in order for the US economy to grow in the long run. So just wanted to mention that too.
Thank you. So I'm getting a sign, but my vision is so bad, I can't see it, so.
1 minute.
Okay, one more question. I'm like, are you cutting me off? Because that's okay too. I'm going to leave the last question for Steve. I'm going to kind of pivot. Everybody's talking about climate change and what we can do, not just be mindful about our utilization, but from a utility company's perspective, the efforts National Grid is making for decarbonization. I think you've shared some of that in previous occasions, but I was hoping that you could share what you all are doing, and it's not the recipe for Coke, but any strategic plans you have to kind of execute.
Sure. We're committed to achieving deep decarbonization of the energy industry, right? And so look to us as to be your partner if that's what you want to do with your company. If you want to reduce your carbon footprint, we want to be your advisor, your partner, your assistant to help you get there. We want to rapidly move off of fossil-based energy sources. A lot of people don't think that's true. You're hearing it directly from me. I lead the business in this region. We want to get off of fossil-based energy sources. We want to preserve affordability, reliability, and choice for customers. We recognize that this is, it has to be what your business wants to do, what you want to do as a person, and we want to be there to help you through that transition. And because of the infrastructure that can be built to enable this, we see tremendous opportunity to make sure that no one's left behind, that everyone has access to the jobs that will be created in this transition. And that we're also out there advocating to make sure that in the policy decisions that are being made, that those who are less likely to be represented in that conversation are not unduly burdened through this transition. So I'll leave it at that, which is think of us as your advisor, partner, strategic advisor on this topic. If you and your business would like to have a meeting, I'm happy to personally set that up for you. Thank you.
Excellent. We're going to open up to questions. Oh.
This got moved back, so I'm going to have to speak loudly, unless you want me to fall off the stage. We're at time. It was a fascinating conversation. Some of you may know that I'm somewhat of a recovering economist, so I'm going to weigh in on Grace's last question about how long do we have to wait for sort of all of these mega trends to sort of go away. And I'll tell you what I tell people, young people in particular, the answer is forever. If you're waiting for the dust to settle, it's not going to. Some other form of dust cloud is going to appear on the horizon. And really what I think you need is the ability to think long-term, plan, prepare for those things that are going to happen, and be able to make the right decisions in the moment when you're confronted with those kind of big impacting issues, whether it's in your personal life or your professional life, or whether you're running some form of government organization. The other thing I'd hoped we'd get into, but particularly as it relates to labor force and the supply of labor, particularly in a region like ours, which is largely white coat and white collar and dependent on a educated, high-performing workforce, is the issue of immigration reform. We are not at replacement birth rates in this country, so we're not making enough people to put into that pipeline of labor to supply our labor needs going forward. For 400 years, I alluded to the Tea Party ship, but for 400 years, Boston has depended on a steady wave of immigrants coming into this country for its labor needs. And right now, we need the federal government to focus on immigration reform, and we need business organizations like ours across the country, as well as government leaders across the country, I think going forward, to mobilize on that issue, because whether you're a red state or a blue state, this is a key issue. So 2 perspectives from sort of the wannabe economist, I guess, in the crowd. Please join me in thanking our panelists and our speaker today. I'll tell you, as an economics junkie, I could have sat here for hours and just listened to this conversation. Again, thank you. Thank you, Joelle, for not only coming here today and the work you do, but also for supporting our son of Boston, Marty Walsh, a good friend to all of ours. And to the panelists and to all of you, a safe and happy holiday season. Thanks for coming today.